Chapter 1. Family Man. Mark stared at the screen, the words swimming before his eyes, his grip tightening on the phone in his hand. "We regret to inform you." He wasn't used to hearing no. Not in business, not in anything. The email from the Arab Fund was a blow he hadn't anticipated, not over something as ridiculous as his personal life. Family stability. Cultural considerations. What did any of that have to do with a $1 trillion investment? He'd built his empire from nothing, and now they were rejecting him because he didn't have a wife? His single status, of all things, was the obstacle in front of him. A cold fury began to settle in his chest. He'd built a reputation on efficiency, on being the man with all the answers, all the power. And now they dared to turn him down, as if his personal life somehow diminished the value he brought to the table. He reread the email, eyes narrowing as he processed the rejection. This decision comes as a result of recent complications with similar trades in the digital finance sector. They were dressing it up in business language, but Mark knew what this was. It wasn't about complications or policy. It was about appearances, about playing the game by their rules. He wasn't the type to jump through hoops for anyone. But here he was, being told to play nice or lose everything. They wanted him to be something he wasn't, a family man, someone who cared about the optics of a perfect life. Wife, kids, white picket fence, all for show. His fingers drummed against the desk, tapping out the rhythm of his frustration. Family stability. It was laughable. He didn't have time for relationships. His focus had always been on one thing, building an empire. And he was damn good at it. Mark could still hear the bankers' voices from their last meeting, one of them leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Is it hard, bro? I bet with that money, it's not." Or, "You don't like girls?" They had laughed, trying to ease the tension in the room, but Mark had kept his cool, even as his annoyance simmered beneath the surface. He wasn't here to joke. He was here to win. And now this email felt like a direct hit to his pride. He pushed back from the desk, pacing the room, his mind already working through the next steps. There had to be a way around this. There was always a way. He wasn't about to let something as trivial as his personal life stand between him and a $1 trillion fund. The Arabs wanted to see family stability? Fine, he could give them that, but it didn't have to be real. Mark paused, a new idea forming. What if he hired someone? A woman to play the part, just for the big dinner. Someone who could impress the investors, charm them into believing he was the stable, committed type. It would be a business arrangement, nothing more. No emotions, no strings attached. Just a role to be played. His mind raced as the plan solidified. It could work. In fact, it would work. The Arab Fund wanted to see a man with roots, with a family-oriented life. Well, he could fake that for a night. It wasn't as if he hadn't staged deals before. This was no different, just a more personal negotiation. He walked back to his desk, his movements more decisive now. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. This wasn't something he could arrange through his usual channels. He needed someone who could be discreet, who could find the right woman for the job. Someone who could play the role of the perfect partner. As his thumb hovered over a name, he hesitated for a split second. This wasn't how he normally operated. But desperate times called for desperate measures. And losing this deal wasn't an option. Not for something as absurd as marital status. Mark hit the call button. As the line rang, he straightened his tuxedo jacket, the fabric cool against his skin, grounding him in the here and now. He wasn't going to let this setback define him. He'd navigate it, just like he always did. The line clicked open. "Hey, it's Mark. I need a favor." His voice was steady, the plan already taking shape in his mind. This would be just another obstacle, one he'd overcome like the rest. They thought they could reject him because of who he was, or wasn't. They'd soon learn just how wrong they were. Chapter 2. Red Hair. The phone call wasn't hard to make. It was a reflex, something Mark had done 1,000 times before when a problem needed solving. But this was different. There was no algorithm for this. No model he could run that would predict the outcome. No numbers he could plug in to make the discomfort go away. As he waited for the voice on the other end to answer, he felt that familiar, uncomfortable tension creeping in the need for control. It was a lesson he'd learned early from his mother, who ruled their household like a general. Growing up, perfection was the standard, and anything less was unacceptable. His mother had expected absolute discipline from him, his father, and his brothers. Success meant perfection. Failure wasn't an option. They thrived under her demanding gaze, but the cost was clear. There was no middle ground, no room for mistakes. Even now, years later, that same drive for control shaped every decision he made. He needed to make sure this went perfectly. Anything less would be failure. The voice on the other end finally picked up, smooth and professional. "You need someone specific?" It was a question he knew was more loaded than it sounded. Mark paused, the words swirling in his mind before he said them. Yes, she needs to be convincing, classy, and able to handle herself in front of investors. The silence on the other end stretched thin, but Mark didn't flinch. This was just another transaction, another piece of the puzzle. The voice came back, professional and calm, cutting through the haze of Mark's thoughts. "I know someone who'll fit the bill. Redhead, beautiful. She make them believe whatever you need her to." There was a tightness in Mark's chest as he nodded, even though the person on the line couldn't see him. "That works. Have her ready by tomorrow night. I need her for a dinner meeting. One night, nothing else." Nothing else. The phrase lingered in his mind, bouncing back and forth as if trying to make sense of its own meaning. Mark hung up without waiting for a response, already pulling up the details for the dinner in his calendar. He didn't like how this felt. It was supposed to be clean, efficient, like everything else he did. But there was something messier, more complicated about this, about needing someone else to play a role in his life. His life had never been about anyone else. It wasn't meant to be messy. Mark sat back down, his hands resting on the smooth, cold surface of his desk. The room was quiet, but it felt loud in his head. His mind worked like a machine, breaking down the logistics, processing the risk. He would bring her to the dinner. The investors would see a man with stability, a man who had more than just wealth and ambition, and that would be enough. It had to be. But deep down, in that quiet part of his mind, he could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. Perfection or nothing. Success or failure. There was no room for gray, no tolerance for anything less than complete control. He couldn't afford to slip. Not here, not now. The next evening came faster than he anticipated. The day blurred into a series of meetings, calls, and decisions that no longer felt real. Just motion, like a machine running on autopilot. But the moment he walked into the restaurant, dressed in a sleek black tuxedo with a white shirt and black bow tie, the world sharpened again. This was it. The part where he became what they needed him to be. Alice was already there, waiting at the bar. Her long, wavy red hair cascaded down her back, framing her face perfectly. She wore a low-cut green dress that hugged her figure, accentuated by a gold brooch at her waist. The sparkling jewelry, a necklace and earrings, caught the soft light of the room, giving her an ethereal glow. She turned, and for a split second, their eyes met, and Mark felt something shift. There was a confidence in the way she held herself, something that made him feel like this was more than just a transaction, more than just control. But he pushed it down, that small flicker of uncertainty, and approached her like he would any business contact. "Mark," she said, her voice smooth, but with an edge that told him she wasn't new to this game. "Alice." His voice was steady, but his mind was racing, calculating, already breaking down the evening into steps. "You understand what I need?" She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I understand exactly what you need." Mark nodded, his grip tightening on the briefcase in his hand. This was it. One night, one show. The fund, the investors, they wouldn't see through it. They wouldn't see through him. He had played this game long enough to know how to wear the mask, how to be what they needed him to be. Chapter 3, Gala Night. Mark sat across from Alice, his eyes scanning the table, the drinks, the slow rise and fall of polite conversation. He felt a disconnect, like he was watching the night unfold from the outside. His hand rested on the edge of the glass in front of him, fingers tapping lightly. He wore his black tuxedo well immaculate, sharp, just like the persona he projected. But tonight, it felt like a costume. Across the table, Alice was playing her part flawlessly. Her long, wavy red hair shimmered in the low light of the upscale restaurant, and the low-cut green dress she wore with the gold brooch at her waist made her seem as though she belonged in this world. The sparkling jewelry, a necklace and earrings, caught the eye of every man in the room. She was laughing, casually leaning into the conversation as though she'd known the investors for years. Mark watched her closely, impressed despite himself. Every time she laughed at the Arab banker's jokes or complimented one of the American investors, they seemed to relax more. He could feel the shift. They were opening up, becoming more comfortable, more likely to say yes to the deal he had so meticulously crafted. But even as the evening went on and the mood lightened, Mark couldn't shake that tightness in his chest. It was working, but it felt off, like he had lost control somewhere in the process, and he wasn't sure where. The Arab banker leaned forward, his eyes flicking between Mark and Alice. He smiled, a little too warmly, his gaze lingering on Alice. "You know, Mark," he said in his smooth, accented English, "you're a very lucky man." Mark's jaw tightened slightly, but he forced a smile. "I try to be." The banker's eyes stayed on Alice. "Beautiful woman," he said, almost under his breath. "And that red hair stunning. You two must be very happy together." Alice didn't miss a beat. She turned to the banker, her smile soft and sincere, as if they really were a couple in love. "We are," she said, her voice smooth, but carrying just enough warmth to sell the lie. "Mark is everything." Mark shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of her words settle on him like a layer of dust. He wasn't sure if it was the lie itself that bothered him, or the way she made it sound so real. He knew it wasn't real. This was just a show, just a deal, but hearing it said out loud, in front of these people, made it feel heavier than it should. The banker smiled again, nodding approvingly, clearly satisfied with what he saw. The Americans were smiling too, clearly impressed by how easily Mark seemed to be blending business with the appearance of personal stability. Everything was falling into place. The conversation continued, with Alice guiding it skillfully, drawing the men in with questions about their families, their travels, and their work. Every time Mark felt a lull coming on, she would interject with something lighter, witty, and the moment would pass. She was good at this. Better than he had anticipated. As the night drew on, Mark could feel the finish line approaching. The fund would be his. The deal would close. He watched as the Arab banker poured another glass of wine for Alice, his eyes warm, his words flowing more freely as the alcohol took effect. Alice leaned in closer, laughing softly at something he said, and before Mark knew it, she reached over, brushing her hand lightly over Mark's arm. It was a subtle gesture, but enough to cement the image of a happy, intimate couple. Mark barely reacted, but inside, he felt that uncomfortable knot in his stomach tighten again. He could feel the eyes on him watching, judging, assessing whether he was the man they wanted to invest in. Alice's performance was impeccable, but it was a performance nonetheless. He wondered if they could see through it. He wondered if he could see through it. Then, suddenly, Alice leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. It was soft, barely a touch, but it caught him off guard. She smiled afterward, turning back to the group as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Mark froze for a second, long enough for it to register. This wasn't in the plan, She wasn't supposed to do that. He was the one who kept control, always, but no one seemed to notice his momentary hesitation. The Arab banker smiled warmly, clearly convinced that this was a genuine relationship. "Very good," he said softly, raising his glass to them. "Very good." The tension in Mark's chest released slightly. It was working. Alice had played her part better than expected. The investors were pleased. They would trust him now. But as the evening began to wind down and the table cleared, Mark found himself standing outside with Alice, the cool night air wrapping around them like a blanket. She looked at him with a faint smile, as if waiting for his approval. Her long red hair danced slightly in the breeze, her green dress catching the faint glow of the streetlights. Mark swallowed, feeling the weight of the night settling in his chest. "You didn't have to kiss me," he said quietly, his voice measured. Alice tilted her head slightly, her eyes gleaming with a hint of mischief. "It helped, didn't it?" He didn't respond. She was right, it had helped. But it had also crossed a line one he hadn't expected to feel so sharply. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice soft but direct, the same question from the night before. Mark hesitated for just a second before nodding. "It's over." But as they stood there, the world seeming to slow around them, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't over at all. Chapter 4. Euphoria. After the dinner, the tension that had gripped Mark throughout the night began to melt away. He leaned back in the plush car seat, a quiet, euphoric buzz in his veins, fueled by the whiskey and the undeniable success of the night. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe. The deal was as good as done. The Arab banker had practically handed it to him, and the investors were completely taken with the image of him and Alice, the perfect, stable couple. Alice sat beside him, quiet but relaxed, her eyes scanning the streets as the car moved through the city. Mark turned his gaze to her, the evening light casting a soft glow on her face, her long wavy red hair cascading over her shoulders. She wore the success of the evening like a second skin, as if everything had gone exactly to her plan. Mark couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration for her. She had played her role perfectly, far beyond his expectations. But in the back of his mind, that same flicker of unease lingered. She had controlled more than he had planned. "Let's celebrate," Mark said, his voice slightly slurred from the drinks. "There's a nightclub not far from here." Alice turned to him, her eyes glimmering with something unreadable but knowing. "Sounds fun," she replied smoothly. "You deserve it after tonight." The nightclub pulsed with energy, a stark contrast to the polished formality of the dinner. The music was loud, the lights a kaleidoscope of colors, and the atmosphere was one of pure indulgence. Mark felt the shift immediately, his body responding to the rhythm, his mind loosening with each passing moment. The euphoria of the deal, combined with the alcohol, blurred the lines between business and pleasure, turning the night into something else entirely. They danced, the crowd around them a blur of bodies and lights. Alice was close, her movements fluid and confident, guiding Mark through the rhythm. Her green dress, the same one she had worn at dinner, clung to her curves, catching the light as they moved. Mark felt himself pulled into her orbit, his hand on her waist, her breath warm against his neck. The professional boundary he had carefully constructed began to dissolve with every sway, every touch. Alice encouraged him to drink more, a subtle but persistent push that he didn't resist. She handed him another glass, her eyes locked on his, watching as he downed it, feeling the warmth spread through his body. The room spun slightly, but Mark didn't care. For once, the weight of control felt light, almost non-existent. They danced for hours, their movements becoming more intimate, more connected. Alice's hand slid up his arm, her fingers tracing a line from his wrist to his shoulder, and Mark found himself leaning into the moment, into her. Everything about the night felt surreal, the success, the celebration, the woman beside him. He couldn't tell if it was the alcohol or something else entirely, but for the first time in a long time, he let go. At some point, the club began to fade into the background, and Mark found himself leading Alice toward the exit. The night air hit him like a wave, cooling the heat that had built up inside the crowded space. His hand was still on her waist, a steadying presence as they walked toward the car waiting for them outside. "Let's take this to the yacht," Alice suggested, her voice low, smooth, and full of suggestion. Mark barely hesitated, nodding as he signaled for the driver to take them to the marina. The prospect of being alone, away from the crowds, from the chaos, felt like exactly what he needed. The yacht cut through the water, the gentle rocking of the waves calming the buzz in Mark's mind. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the water and the deck of the yacht. Mark stood at the edge, looking out at the endless horizon, the cool night air sobering him slightly. Alice was behind him, and he could feel her presence before she even touched him. She came up beside him, her hand slipping into his, her fingers cold against his skin but grounding. "Quite the night," she whispered, her voice soft, almost vulnerable. Mark turned to her, his body still humming with the mixture of alcohol and adrenaline. For a moment, he looked at her, not as part of the plan, not as the woman he had hired for the night, but as someone who had seamlessly entered his world, someone who had played her role so perfectly that she felt indispensable. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice thick. "It's been a hell of a night." Alice smiled, her eyes catching the moonlight, and for the first time, Mark noticed something deeper behind that smile, a quiet calculation, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. She stepped closer, her body pressing against his as she leaned into him, her lips brushing against his neck. "You deserve this," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "All of it." Mark's hands found her waist, pulling her closer as their lips met in a slow, deliberate kiss. There was no hesitation this time, no questioning whether this was part of the plan or not. In that moment, everything felt right. The success, the celebration, the woman in his arms, it all fell into place. Under the moonlight, they moved together, the world outside of this moment slipping away. The night stretched on, and Mark found himself losing track of time, of control, of everything that had defined him up until now. He let Alice take the lead, her soft whispers, her touch, guiding him through the night. Later, when it was over, Mark lay on the deck, his breath slowing, his body sinking into a deep, heavy exhaustion. Alice lay beside him, her head resting on his chest, her hand tracing lazy circles on his skin. Mark's eyes fluttered closed, the pull of sleep too strong to resist. For the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to let go, to fall into the quiet oblivion of sleep without a second thought. As Mark drifted off, Alice turned her head slightly, watching him with bright, shining eyes. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Her mind raced with thoughts of what the night had set in motion, the possibilities that stretched out before her. The billionaire beside her was just the beginning. Her hands slid down to her stomach, resting there for a moment as she imagined what the future would bring. The plan was already in motion, and with Mark's guard completely down, there was nothing stopping her from getting exactly what she wanted. With a quiet, satisfied smile, Alice closed her eyes. The moonlight still shimmering on the water, the future ahead as bright and full of promise as the night had been. Chapter 5. Flashback. 2 weeks before the yacht and the moonlit night, Alice found herself sitting in a plush chair in her madam's office. The room was sleek, tastefully decorated, far removed from the gritty reality of the business it represented. Across from her sat the madam, a poised woman in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She slid a neatly folded check across the desk towards Alice. $10,000 one night, the madam said, her voice calm but firm. "You'll meet him at the restaurant. Make sure the investors are impressed, and that's it." Alice picked up the check, a small smile curling at the edges of her lips. $10,000, she repeated, her mind racing with the possibilities that kind of money could unlock. She knew Mark's name already. His reputation in the tech and finance world was well known. But to see the number of zeros attached to this gig made it all the more real. She stood up, tucking the check into her purse, her heart pounding in excitement. As she turned to leave the office, one of the other girls, a bubbly brunette named Jessica, caught her eye. Jessica was lounging on a couch by the door, flipping through a magazine and looking bored until she heard Alice's footsteps. Her eyes brightened when she saw Alice holding the check. "You got the Mark Johnson gig?" Jessica said, her voice rising with mock envy. "Lucky you. Billionaire tech guys are the easiest. They're so busy counting money, they don't even notice anything else." Alice smirked, sitting down beside her, a glint of pride in her eyes. "Yeah, lucky me. $10,000 for one night? That's more than lucky." Jessica laughed, a playful gleam in her eye. "Well, if I had a date with a billionaire like him, you bet I'd be doing more than just impressing his investors." Alice raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh yeah, what would you do?" Jessica leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I'd make sure I walked away with more than money. A baby, maybe. Can you imagine a billionaire's baby? You'd be set for life." Alice froze for a split second, her heart skipping a beat. The idea was so outrageous, so audacious, that she hadn't even considered it. But now that Jessica had said it out loud, it stirred something deep within her. The possibility. The power of it. She forced a laugh, waving it off. "Yeah, sure. Too bad I'm on birth control." The two of them giggled, but inside, Alice's thoughts had taken a sharp turn. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but Jessica's words kept echoing in Alice's mind. A billionaire's baby. It seemed like a joke at first, but the more she thought about it, the more sense it made. Mark wasn't just another rich client. He was powerful, connected, and most importantly, he had something she wanted. The life she had always dreamed of, the security she craved, and now she had an opportunity to get it. Later that evening, Alice stood in her bathroom, staring down at the small white pill in her hand. Birth control. A barrier between her and the potential future she had just started imagining. Her reflection in the mirror stared back at her, her eyes calculating, sharp. She thought about her life, the endless cycle of gigs, the promises of financial freedom that never quite materialized. The nights spent catering to men with power, but never wielding any of it herself. She was always on the outside, always playing a part in someone else's world. But with Mark, this could be different. If she could make this work, she wouldn't just be part of his world, she could control it. A baby would tie him to her forever. And in his universe, that kind of connection meant more than money, it meant power. With a deep breath, Alice made her decision. She opened the toilet lid and, without hesitation, dropped the pill into the water. Her hand lingered over the handle for just a second, then she flushed. She watched as the small pill disappeared, swirling away, leaving nothing but a clean slate in its wake. Alice stood there for a moment longer, her heart pounding with both fear and exhilaration. She had crossed a line, but she knew there was no turning back now. She had set the plan in motion, and soon, Mark would be caught in her web. Her fingers trailed over her stomach as she stared at her reflection one last time. A billionaire's baby, she whispered to herself, her lips curling into a smile. She was going to make it happen. Chapter 6. Ocean Turmoil. The morning light was harsh against the open expanse of the ocean, casting sharp reflections off the water as Mark gradually opened his eyes. His head throbbed from the remnants of last night's celebration, the details slipping in and out of his foggy memory. He could hear the gentle lapping of the waves against the yacht's hull, a stark contrast to the pulsating music and laughter that had filled the night before. Slowly, he turned his head to find Alice beside him, her back turned, red hair tangled against the pillow. For a moment, he stared blankly at the back of her head, the warmth of last night evaporating as the reality of the morning set in. The alcohol had blurred the lines between pleasure and business, But now, in the cool light of day, everything seemed clear again. Alice was just another escort. Another fleeting night in a life where women came and went, but nothing ever really stuck. Mark sat up slowly, pressing his fingers to his temples, trying to dull the headache pounding through his skull. He stood and moved toward the deck, the early sunlight glaring off the open sea. As the cool breeze hit him, the last vestiges of the night seemed to wash away, leaving behind only the raw truth. From behind him, Alice stirred, her voice soft but casual. "Morning," she said, still playing the part, as if nothing had changed. Mark didn't turn to face her. Instead, he let out a low, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Let's get you back to the marina before I have to pay for another 10,000. His words cut the air between them like a knife, cold and transactional. Alice, still playing along, smiled a smile that was far more calculated than it appeared. She knew the game well, better than most. "Of course," she replied smoothly, pulling herself out of bed, her face betraying nothing. She'd known this would come. Mark, like all the others, was distant now. But this time, the stakes were different. This time, she had the upper hand. Mark took the helm of the yacht, his hands steady on the wheel, the horizon steady ahead as he steered them back toward the marina. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic rocking of the boat were the only sounds as they cut through the water, the city skyline slowly coming into view. Neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable, at least not for Alice. She knew exactly how this was going to play out. Mark, on the other hand, seemed lost in his own thoughts, driving the yacht with the same efficiency he applied to every aspect of his life. He had regained control of the situation, at least in his mind, now that the night was over. When they finally docked at the marina, Mark stayed on the yacht, his hand still on the wheel as he stared out over the water. He didn't even glance at Alice as she gathered her things and stepped off the boat. "Take care," Alice said, her voice casual, the sweetness of her words masking the deeper intentions that lay beneath them. Mark gave a small nod, still not looking at her. "Yeah, you too." And with that, Alice walked away, leaving the marina behind as Mark remained on his yacht, the last traces of their night together fading into the background. As soon as she was out of sight, Alice's casual smile dropped, replaced by the calculating expression she wore so well. She hadn't expected warmth, hadn't expected anything more than what she got. After all, she had already set the bigger trap. Alice turned on her heel and walked away from the marina, blending into the city's rhythm as easily as she had slipped into Mark's world. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a message from one of her friends. "Lunch today?" A smirk tugged at the corner of Alice's lips as she texted back. "Absolutely. I've got a story to tell." Over lunch, Alice sat across from her friend, casually recounting the events of the night before, her voice light and breezy, as if it was just another night with a client. Her friend, a striking blonde named Chloe, listened intently, her eyes wide with curiosity. "So, how was he?" Chloe asked, leaning in, eager for details. Alice shrugged, swirling her wine glass lazily. "Oh, you know. Rich, successful, too self-absorbed to notice much beyond his wallet. The usual." Chloe laughed, shaking her head. "You always get the interesting ones. What's next? Think he'll call you again?" Alice smiled, her eyes gleaming with something far more dangerous than amusement. "Oh, I doubt it. But I've already made sure I'm not just a one-night memory." Chloe raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What does that mean?" Alice waved it off with a laugh. "Nothing. Just that I'm always careful about leaving a lasting impression." That evening, Alice sat in her apartment, her phone resting lightly in her hand. She tapped out a message to Mark, her fingers moving deliberately over the screen. "Hey, just checking in. Did we use protection last night? I can't really remember. A little drunk, you know." She hit send, waiting for his response, her pulse steady. She knew exactly how to play this. A few moments later, her phone buzzed, his reply short and dismissive. "Don't remember either." but I'm good." Alice's smirk deepened as she typed out her next message, playing her part perfectly. "Same here. I'm on birth control anyway, but you never really know." She stared at the screen, watching as the message sat unread for a moment before the familiar read receipt appeared. He didn't respond. Just left her on read as she had expected. But Alice wasn't fazed. In fact, she liked it that way. The silence told her everything she needed to know. Mark had no idea what he had walked into. She set the phone down, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. The trap was set, and all she had to do now was wait. Chapter 7. Waiting Game. The first morning after the night on the yacht, Alice felt nothing. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, willing herself to feel something. Anything. A twinge of nausea, a wave of dizziness, even the slightest hint of fatigue. But the hours passed, and her body remained unchanged. It was too early, she told herself. These things take time. The first few days were manageable. Alice went through the motions of her life, keeping up appearances as she always had. She met friends for coffee, attended events, and put on the perfect smile. But behind that facade, her mind was fixated on one thing: the pregnancy. Every small ache, every minor shift in her body became a potential sign. She was hyper-aware, listening to the rhythm of her body with an intensity that bordered on obsession. By the end of the first week, frustration began to set in. There were no symptoms. No nausea, no dizziness, nothing that hinted at the life she was trying so desperately to create. She stood in front of her mirror one morning, scrutinizing her reflection. She pressed a hand to her flat stomach, as if sheer willpower could make something happen. "It's too soon," she whispered to herself, but her patience was wearing thin. She needed confirmation, something tangible, something to tell her that her plan was working. Meanwhile, across the city, Mark had moved on without a second thought. The night with Alice, the brief fling on the yacht, it was all a distant memory, filed away like another transaction in his meticulously managed life. He had more important things to focus on now. The investors were thrilled with the deal, and the potential profits from the new investment had become his sole focus. His mind was consumed by meetings, projections, and market strategies. Alice was nothing more than a fleeting distraction in his past. But for Alice, Mark had become an integral part of her future. The idea of being pregnant with his child, of securing her place in his world, consumed her. The days stretched on, and she became increasingly fixated on what could be. When she wasn't anxiously checking for signs, she was daydreaming, letting her fantasies spiral into elaborate visions of what her life would be. She imagined herself pregnant, walking through high-end boutiques, shopping for baby clothes, her belly round with Mark's child. In these daydreams, Mark was by her side, his hand protectively resting on her back as they picked out cribs and strollers. He wasn't distant or cold. He was attentive, loving even, his focus on her and their future together. At night, her dreams took on a life of their own. She dreamt of a life married to Mark, living in a sprawling mansion, the two of them hosting glamorous parties for the elite of society. She dreamt of their child, a beautiful boy or girl with Mark's eyes and her hair, running through the halls of their luxurious home. In these dreams, everything was perfect. She was no longer an outsider, no longer just another escort. She was part of Mark's world, elevated by the child she would bear. The fantasies were intoxicating, pulling her deeper into her obsession. She began sleeping more, sinking into those dreams every chance she got. It was easier to live in the fantasy than in the frustrating reality where nothing seemed to be happening. Each time she woke up, she would lie still for a moment, clinging to the fragments of her dreams, hoping they would soon become real. But reality always crept back in, and with it came doubt. What if the plan didn't work? What if she wasn't pregnant? The thought gnawed at her, making her restless. During the day, she found herself zoning out, lost in thoughts of what could be. She would replay conversations in her head, imagining how she would tell Mark the news, how he would react. Would he be shocked, angry? Or would he accept it, maybe even see the potential for the kind of life she dreamed of? 2 weeks passed, and still nothing. No nausea, no fatigue, no signs that she was carrying the future she had imagined so vividly. Alice grew more anxious, her patience fraying with each passing day. She would stand in front of the mirror, pressing her hand against her stomach, as if that would somehow trigger a change. She scoured the internet, reading articles and forums about early pregnancy symptoms. Convincing herself that it was just too early to tell, her dreams became more frequent, more vivid. In them, she could almost feel the weight of the baby in her arms, the warmth of Mark's hand on hers as they stood together, a perfect family. The fantasy was so real in her mind that waking up felt like a disappointment. Every time she opened her eyes to find her body unchanged, her flat stomach mocking her, it stung. She would sit up, her heart sinking with the realization that the future she was so desperate for was still out of reach. Still, Alice didn't give up hope. She couldn't. Her entire plan, her entire future hinged on this. She convinced herself that it was only a matter of time before the symptoms began, before the confirmation came. She clung to her dreams, to the image of herself as Mark's wife, their child tying them together forever. It had to happen. It just had to. And so, Alice waited, her mind dancing between reality and the fantasies she had built. Every day felt like a step closer to the life she wanted. Even if the signs weren't there yet, she refused to believe that her plan could fail. The dreams were too vivid, too perfect to be nothing more than dreams. When 15 days were completed, she would finally know. Chapter 8. Positive. On day 15, Alice woke up with a jolt, her heart pounding. Something felt off, different from the usual restless mornings she'd grown accustomed to over the past 2 weeks. The room was quiet, the morning light filtering in softly through the curtains, but Alice's mind was racing. She reached for her phone and checked the calendar. A realization settled over her like a wave. Her period was late. Her heart raced as she threw back the covers and hurried to the bathroom. Her hands shook as she rummaged through the cabinet, pulling out the pregnancy test she'd been saving for this moment. She stared at it for a second, taking a deep breath to steady herself. This was it. After weeks of dreaming, fantasizing, and obsessing, this was the moment she had been waiting for. The seconds dragged on as she waited for the result. Alice's pulse thrummed in her ears, her gaze fixed on the test. Slowly the lines appeared, negative, her stomach dropped, and a wave of disappointment washed over her. Negative, the word echoed in her mind, taunting her. How could it be? She'd been so certain, so convinced that her plan was working. But there it was, staring back at her failure. Alice sank onto the bathroom floor, her head resting against the cool tiles. Her mind whirled with frustration, disbelief, and confusion. She had been so sure. The dreams, the fantasies, they had felt so real. But now, it all seemed to collapse around her. As the day wore on, the disappointment gnawed at her. Alice couldn't focus on anything. She wandered through her apartment aimlessly, lost in her thoughts. Her body ached with cramps, the pain sharp and unrelenting. She was certain her period was coming. She could feel it building inside her, the familiar discomfort pulling her deeper into her frustration. By evening, Alice had resigned herself to the reality that her plan had failed. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her, but some small, stubborn part of her refused to give up hope. Maybe, she whispered to herself, just maybe it's not over yet. Driven by that last shred of hope, she grabbed another test and took it, her movements mechanical. As though she were just going through the motions, she expected nothing. She expected another stark negative result. But when she glanced at the test minutes later, her breath caught in her throat. Positive. For a moment, she couldn't believe it. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the test, her hands trembling. The second line, faint but undeniable, was there. Positive. A surge of relief, disbelief, and exhilaration swept over her all at once. She had done it. She was pregnant. The reality she had dreamed of for weeks was finally materializing. Alice's body trembled with emotion, her eyes welling with tears, not of sadness, but of victory. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The next few days passed in a haze. Alice found herself floating through her routine, her mind constantly drifting to the baby growing inside her. She could already picture how everything would change. She imagined herself telling Mark, his face shifting from shock to acceptance as he realized what this meant. She envisioned herself in his world, their world, bound together by their child. But first, she had to tell him. Alice wasn't naive. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Mark wasn't the type to embrace surprise. He valued control, structure, and order, and this news would shatter all of that. But Alice had no doubt that, in time, he would come to see the value in it. He would see her not as a fleeting distraction, but as someone who could anchor him, ground him in a way no one else could. The email was short and direct. She didn't want to risk overplaying her hand or giving him too much time to think. With the lab results attached, she typed the words carefully. "Mark, I'm pregnant. Let's talk." Her finger hovered over the send button for a moment, and then, with a quiet breath, she clicked it. Mark sat in his office, his mind entirely consumed by work. He was in the middle of a meeting when the notification popped up on his screen. His eyes barely glanced at it at first, just another email, another task in a sea of tasks. But then he saw her name, Alice. A brief flicker of confusion crossed his mind. He hadn't thought about her in weeks. After that night on the yacht, she had drifted into the background, eclipsed by the whirlwind of his business ventures. He assumed that was the end of it. Another night, another deal, nothing more. But as his eyes scanned the email, his blood ran cold. "I'm pregnant. Let's talk." The words hit him like a physical blow, his body stiffening in his chair. For a moment, everything around him faded, the voices in the meeting, the hum of his office, the numbers on his screen. All he could see were those words, pregnant. Mark's mind raced, replaying that night in fragments. The drinking, the blurred lines, the vague memory of her asking about protection. He had brushed it off, too absorbed in the haze of the moment to think about the consequences. But now, staring at the email, he felt a mix of anger and disbelief bubble up inside him. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't part of the plan. He had worked too hard to keep control of his life, to keep his world tightly managed. And now, this, a child. With Alice, for a moment, he felt paralyzed, unsure of what to do. His mind raced through the possibilities. She could be lying, playing some kind of angle, trying to trap him. But the lab results were attached. It seemed too real to be a game. Mark closed his laptop, his jaw clenched, his pulse pounding in his ears. This would change everything. He knew that much. The life he had so carefully built, the empire he had created, the structure he relied on, all of it was now under threat. Because of one night. He sat back in his chair, his thoughts a storm of confusion, anger, and disbelief. Alice had sent him the email. But it wasn't just a message, it was the opening move in a game that he wasn't ready to play. Chapter 9, Life Ahead. Mark stood at the edge of his office, staring out the window. The city sprawled out beneath him, distant and cold. His mind still buzzed with the email from Alice. It had been weeks, but her message hung over him like a cloud he couldn't shake. "I'm pregnant. Let's talk." The words had changed everything, pulling his carefully constructed life into chaos. He still didn't believe it. He didn't want to believe it. Alice was supposed to be a one-night fling, a distraction from his relentless focus on work. He had never imagined that a single night would lead to this, a child, a lifetime connection with someone he barely knew. And yet, here he was, standing on the precipice of something he wasn't ready for. Frustration and anger bubbled up inside him. How could he have let this happen? He had always been so careful, so controlled. But that night, with the alcohol and the thrill of success, everything had blurred. Now Alice had thrown a wrench into his plans, and he had no idea how to respond. Before he could make a decision, he did what he always did in moments like these. He turned to his best friend and lawyer, Tom. "I don't believe it," Mark said, pacing Tom's office, his voice sharp with frustration. "She said she was on birth control. We were drunk. I don't even remember half of it, but I sure as hell didn't plan on this." Tom sat behind his desk, listening carefully, his face neutral. He had been Mark's lawyer for years, but more than that, he was the one person Mark trusted when things spun out of control. And right now, everything felt out of control. "She's just a one-night stand, Tom," Mark continued, his hands gesturing wildly. "I have nothing to do with her. And I sure as hell don't have time to be a father. I can't believe I fell for this." Tom leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Look, Mark, I get it. This wasn't part of your plan, and I understand how frustrating this is. But let me ask you something. Is it really worth it to fight this in court? You've got more money than you can spend in 10 lifetimes. Do you really want to deal with the mess, the public scrutiny, the potential fallout?" Mark's jaw tightened. The idea of dragging this through a legal battle made him sick. The media would have a field day, and it would disrupt everything he had built. But the thought of accepting the situation, of being tied to Alice, made his blood boil. "I don't have time for this," Mark muttered. "I don't have time to be a father. And I don't trust her. She planned this. I know she did." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. You'll never know for sure. But here's what I do know. You're swimming in money right now. This isn't going to ruin you financially. If anything, accepting it might even make things easier for you." Mark turned to him, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Tom smiled slightly, leaning forward. "Think about it. You've been trying to get more access to the conservatory fund, right? The one that puts a lot of value on family and stability? Having a child, settling down, it could actually open more doors for you. I'm not saying this is ideal, but it could be an opportunity. A way to frame this in your favor." Mark paused, the gears in his mind turning. He hated how logical Tom made it sound. It felt like he was being pushed into something he didn't want, but he couldn't deny that it made sense. After a long silence, Mark finally exhaled. "Yeah, speaking of money, a child might even mean greater access to the conservatory fund." Tom nodded, his expression calm. "Exactly. Sometimes you've got to make the best out of a messy situation. You don't have to love it, Mark, but you've got to play the game." Final chapter. 2 years later. The sun shined brightly over the sprawling estate, the manicured lawn dotted with balloons and decorations for Josh's first birthday party. It was a picture-perfect event, the kind you'd expect for the child of a billionaire. Caterers, a lavish cake, and a sea of well-dressed guests. The kind of celebration Alice had once only dreamed of. Alice stood near the patio, watching the party unfold around her. She wore an elegant dress, her long red hair styled perfectly, fitting seamlessly into this new world of wealth and privilege. From the outside, it seemed like she had everything: a luxurious life, a child, and the father of her son, standing just a few feet away. But the truth was far more complicated. Mark was there, of course. He had been a good father, present for important moments, financially supportive, making sure their son wanted for nothing. But when it came to Alice, he remained distant, cold, a shell of the man who had shared that night with her on the yacht. Their relationship was a far cry from the one Alice had once dreamed of. The dreams of love, of family, had long since faded. Now they coexisted, tied together by Josh, but separated by a wall of distrust and resentment that neither of them could tear down. As the party continued, Alice and Mark found themselves standing together near the birthday cake, exchanging tense words over something trivial. You didn't have to order so many balloons, Mark said quietly, his tone irritated. It's excessive. Alice's lips tightened. It's a first birthday, Mark. It's supposed to be special. They stood in awkward silence, the weight of their unspoken conflict hanging between them. 2 years had passed, but the distance between them remained the same. Alice had carved out a life within Mark's world, but she knew she would never be truly part of it. He tolerated her presence because of Josh, but that was where his warmth ended. I'll take care of the next one, Mark muttered under his breath. Alice turned away, her eyes scanning the party for a distraction. She spotted Josh, their beautiful smiling red-haired son, running towards them, his face lit up with joy. He was oblivious to the tension between his parents, his world still innocent and pure. Josh threw his tiny arms around his mother's leg, looking up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy!" He squealed, then turned to Mark. "Daddy!" Alice knelt down, smoothing a hand through Josh's hair. "What is it, sweetheart?" Josh looked between them, his little face glowing with excitement. "I love you," he said, his words stumbling over each other in the way only a 1-year-old's could. Mark and Alice froze for a moment, their gazes meeting over Josh's head. In that instant, the tension melted, if only for a brief second. They shared a forced smile, knowing that, no matter how fractured their relationship was, they were forever tied together by this child. Josh's laughter filled the air as he ran off again, leaving his parents standing side by side, both painfully aware of the future they were now bound to share. Mark turned to Alice, his voice softer than before. "We'll make it work, for him." Alice nodded, her smile faint but genuine. "For him." And so they stood there, two people who would never fully trust each other again, but who had no choice but to navigate the uncertain future ahead. As Josh ran through the party, the embodiment of their shared history and their inescapable bond, Mark and Alice remained locked in their uneasy truce, forever connected by the child they both loved, even as distrust lingered just beneath the surface. And that's the story of how one woman's desperation and a billionaire's guarded heart led to a new life that changed everything forever. Beneath all the power and wealth, they were just two people caught in a web of lies and fragile dreams. If this emotional journey resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the raw vulnerability behind the headlines. Thanks for watching.